Well, hello everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of CME in Conversation. And for this episode, I'm delighted to welcome music education researcher Emma Nenadic. So, Emma, if you could just give us a little bit of a flavour of the kind of work you do and where you work, all that kind of stuff before we kick off.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, Liz. It's really brilliant to be here in the CME series. And so my name's Emma Nenadic, and I'm a research assistant in the Centre for the Practice and Culture in Education at Birmingham City University. And I'm a member of the Birmingham Music Education Research Group. And I'm really interested in partnership working in music education. So I recently finished a PhD that looked at lots of diverse factors that influence learning within music education partnership projects. So that's a real interest of mine that we'll be talking about today. But we have quite a busy range of projects that happen across BCU. So I'm currently researching parity of access to whole class ensemble tuition for children with additional needs. I'm looking at composing pedagogies in the primary school classroom and also the value of creativities in the primary school as well, and they all bring in partnership on some level. So that's been a really nice kind of, continuity with the work.
Wow, you sound like a very, very busy lady.
Yeah, it's definitely busy. It keeps us on our toes, and lots of. I suppose we were in a big city with lots of schools, so try and kind of have a positive impact in as many schools as possible.
Fantastic. So it's the partnership, as you say, it's the partnership stuff that I'm really interested in talking to you today, because on the CME in Unit 2, which is about planning, delivering and evaluating music education, there is a random little section that kind of, in all honesty, doesn't quite go with all the rest of the stuff that's in that unit. And it's something that I think trips our learners up quite a lot, because it asks you about partnership working, characteristics of effective partnerships, asks you to talk about partnerships you've been involved in. And for a lot of our learners, they maybe haven't actually had that experience of partnership working, or they're working in an organization that does work in partnership, but because of the kind of rung of the career ladder that they're on, they're not really involved in that. So we sometimes find our learners struggle a little bit to evidence that. So I was thinking a
Mm.
bit of a chat with you might provide some additional support for that, really. So ideally, I think I'd like to kick off with your thoughts on what the kind of the characteristics of effective partnerships are based on what you've seen in your research.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before I get into the characteristics, I would also recognize that it can feel like quite a niche area. And when I worked in project management in learning teams and organizations, there wasn't necessarily a rule book, sorry, or a guidebook in how to do this. So, it is definitely something that like understandably might feel quite vague or, quite daunting if you're really at that early stage in your career. So hopefully, some of the advice that we touch on will help. So I think, one of the first characteristics of effective partnership working is that it's genuinely collaborative. So this might be at the infrastructure level where a school and a music organization can come together and you get more value added. They're able to produce something that they wouldn't have been able to achieve if they were working alone. But I think it's not just about value added and resource. I think to make something genuinely collaborative in a partnership, there's chance to share your values and your philosophies of how you work. You get a real understanding of each other's work. So, you understand where the music teacher's coming from, you understand where the artist is coming from. And it's that kind of like reflection that will come onto that can enable that understanding to grow. So in one school that I researched, for example, the music teacher was very, very passionate about the raw talent that he saw in his students and wanting them to have a very hands-on approach to music education. He also thought that their voices weren't heard enough in their local community and in their school system. He felt that music was quite sidelined and that something needed to happen so that they could be heard. And actually, the composer who went and worked in that school was a very socially engaged artist, and his songwriting approach was very much, based on the voices of the people he worked with, and that was kind of like, where it built from. So that was quite a perfect marriage, you could say. But they bought into the project, and the project had momentum because they both identified those sort of, values that they had and shared those values. So, it kind of gave it that sense of like, oh, this is actually, we're doing the right thing here. So I definitely think that's kind of, a touchstone of being genuinely collaborative. And then I think another thing I would say is that, as we know, there is a myth of musical, geniuses and maestros being out there in the world. And, a composer being the celebrity, or an orchestral musician or a pop artist, kind of like being in this whole other, universe. So if you actually model and share your practices and approaches really transparently and talk about them a lot, that can actually really help to bust that myth. And children of all ages, there's actually research that shows children who are really young can compare their own playing or their own composing to the composing of professional composers or musicians. So, it can give them a sense of their own musical selves, provided that those practices are actually distilled and shared. And this is also just being open to, kind of debating issues that come up. So in one of the schools that I observed, the partnership project had a bit of discord that happens. It can be sometimes quite a complicated thing to do. And the composer was able to explain, that when you gather material for a participatory commission, for example, that involves children and composers working together, not all of that material can make it into the final piece. And it was debating that openly and discussing why that's the case, that I think was able to kind of, put the children and the composer and the teacher on kind of a level playing field. So without that, there can be this kind of myth that the composer just goes away or the musician just goes away, and they have this whole private sort of, separate elite world that they're in, and that can be quite alienating for schools and for children. So I think that transparency is really important. And I think, if that happens, then it's empowering to young people, because, music has so much potential to be disempowering if it's not, kind of taught or led in the right way. So that's a really important aspect, I think. And I think linked to that, it's about joint planning and joint reflection. So there's a quote I really like by Hallam that says that partnerships need to define what is meant by quality and how it's assured. So it's up to yourself, if you're in a partnership working with the partners, to really define what that quality looks like, rather than kind of being distracted by other metrics and other KPIs and things like that. And it's through joint planning and joint reflection that you can kind of keep that central to the discussion. It might be that there are emerging kind of things that are coming up in terms of like the young people's needs, things that are going well, things that aren't going so well. But by kind of being able to talk about that openly and problem solve together, it will make the whole experience actually more joyful as well, and like less tense and less hectic, because it is hectic. Partnership projects are quite demanding, so it's important to do that. It really pays off actually to do those debriefs. And it as we like to say, in the music education research world, it stops projects just being about the victory narratives, because you're actually not just kind of celebrating the really easy things to celebrate. You've got really deep into the practice and you've made changes where they need to be made. So that's probably another key point. And then I've got two more in answer to this question, if that's okay. So I think another big finding from my PhD was just about contextual awareness. And I'd like to acknowledge the OMI Trust, a charity in Birmingham, who have given me this kind of term, this idea of parity of access. So, equal access to musical participation. If you for some reason don't gather that kind of contextual awareness from the get-go, you might inadvertently promote approaches to musical teaching and learning that are not really appropriate or inclusive for some of the children in that school. Sometimes, unfortunately, worst case scenario, which I did come across, is kind of not appropriate for the whole class, actually, for various reasons. So it could be things like children in a particular school haven't yet learned a particular way of reading music, so they might not use sheet music, whereas schools down the road do, and it might be really brilliant in one school and just quite alienating in another. So it's just being aware of that, really. And also that's also about reasonable expectations for all involved, which is something that Kresek, a researcher, talks about. Freelance musicians have a pretty difficult job too. They don't necessarily know the culture of that school, the existing musical culture. And if they're contracted by a music organisation, it's really important that the music organisation creates reasonable expectations for all involved so that everybody can work effectively. So yeah, and the National Plan for Music Education, the Refresh Plan, talks about music education for all. So that contextual awareness will make sure it truly is happening. There truly is a music education for all in the school. And then I think my final point in terms of characteristics of effective partnerships is that learning is at the heart of the work. These projects are a huge undertaking for teachers and for schools, and they're really logistically demanding and can become all consuming. So there must be some kind of educational benefit. And I mean, there usually is, and that learning, is really meaningful. And I personally really get a lot out of seeing hundreds of children on a stage and in a concert hall. And I think most of us do, really, but it's kind of working beyond that to make sure that the skills and the knowledge kind of implicitly being thought about and kind of considered. And that's where you can really get the best out of both parties. The pedagogical expertise of a teacher can really kind of support formulating those learning goals, and then the artists and their maybe domain specific knowledge of music education can really kind of explore new avenues in terms of how to achieve those learning goals. So yeah, I think sometimes projects that I observe that didn't pay enough attention to this. Sometimes, I actually had some young people who described the composing approach in the school as being a bit weird, and that's not how you do composing, and feeling a little bit just strange about the whole thing. So perhaps, it just didn't really chime with what they were doing. So I think they're the main kind of themes that I would start as a primer for your CME students to think about.
That's fantastic. You give me so many things to think about there. And when you were talking about all those different aspects, I was thinking about the national plan, and the fact that this iteration of the national plan has got a much better handle on what hubs and schools look like when they work in partnership. And just right towards the end there, you were talking about the importance of all parties having a say, and everybody kind of respecting each other's expertise. And I feel like the first national plan that we had didn't really do that. It was more about hubs doing things to schools. And now our new plan is very much about hubs and schools working in partnerships, which I think is definitely the right way forward. I still think we find with some, and it's not just limited to music hubs, but examples from the CME, when we've had students who've struggled with this a bit, sometimes if they work for a music hub, their answer to that sort of criterion is, well, we already are a partnership with the school, so therefore we're a partnership, so I don't have to think about this. That's it. I just, because I'm going to school at this particular time and teaching these particular children, that is partnership working.
Yeah.
And I think what you've articulated really well is that actually a real partnership is going beyond that. There's a difference between oh, we'll provide you some money to do something, or oh, we'll provide a service to you, but it's about going further than that, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we all want an infrastructure in our locality that makes the best of the music charities, the schools, the industrial paths, kind of freelance musicians. But it's when you actually, get past that point where you put your model together and people have signed the contract, where you really actually want to make it something that, I guess, furthers everybody's learning, and has a legacy, is sustainable. It maps onto what people really care about, so that they can take that forward as well. So yeah, definitely, you could almost say that sharing of resources is really basic cooperation, whereas partnership, collaboration, that requires an actual kind of shift in your mindset. a kind of open-mindedness to who you're working with.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was also really interested in what you said about quality and how the kind of partnership needs to define its own sort of concept of quality. And obviously, both of us have worked alongside Professor Martin Fortley, who we know is obsessed with quality.
Yes.
I think we were both at his Christmas lecture about that.
Yeah.
And as kind of as a result of kind of talking to Martin, but also having just seen this idea of high quality turning up in every single document that comes out of the DFE, comes out of Ofsted, I've kind of got a little bit perhaps obsessed with this idea, and I'm in the middle myself of a research project where I can't really describe what I'm doing because I haven't decided yet, but I'm basically collating lots of different people's opinions of what quality is, because when I set out on this kind of little journey, I was just intending to write a bit of an article about what quality is in music education. And I found that people's ideas of what quality was so disparate, and it was very contextualized. And you gave us an example there about kind of reading music and stuff, and that came into it. There were some people who were like, unless the children reading music and unless it's taught by a specialist, it can't be quality. And then there were people who were saying the opposite. And it was very contextual. So that idea of the partnership creating its own idea of quality is, I
Yeah.
guess, what I'm trying to do with all the hundreds of responses I've had. Some kind of like, okay, we can't say what one version of quality is, however, this is what we currently believe as active music educators at the time. I don't know whether that will scale up very well into, you know, useful for everybody, but it's interesting to see that, you know, that was like for you a key part of how you make a partnership work.
Yeah, but can you tell me the answer when you finished your research project, please? And then we can all have more peace of mind, because this question has been rumbling on, hasn't it, for so many years. And it's such a fascinating one. And actually, I went to the Birmingham Music Education Hub at the beginning of this year, and I presented on what quality partnerships look like. And that's where I really, pulled that quote, because I wanted to, I suppose, like leave that message that it is really, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, something that you do have to, think about in a more kind of, contextual way. However, yeah, I think it's, what is it? Quality frameworks, quality standards, quality learning experiences, quality learning opportunities. There are so many different prefixes and kind of, different ways of thinking about it. So I reckon it's actually being able to share and keep it on the agenda, which I'm sure your research, once you've defined it, you sound like a true researcher there, will be really useful. I think it's kind of just good practice to share and keep revisiting the question of what quality looks like.
Yeah, and I like the idea of people being able to define their own concept of quality, but I feel like there needs to be some kind of support for them to do that, in order that they don't go completely wrong, you know, from
Yeah.
the start. So it'll be interesting to see if I can achieve that. We might be here in 20 years time and I might still be trying to do that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So moving back into partnerships, I wanted to ask you, because for a lot of our CME learners, they haven't been involved in a partnership. And we have, for example, people who, in fact, we have an inordinate proportion of people who are piano teachers on the CME. It's just, I don't know why, but that's just how it's happened. And a lot of them just work for themselves. So they're basically just teaching from home. And with the piano obviously being the sort of instrument that's very difficult to teach in a group, they tend to be a very kind of one-to-one structure. And as a consequence of that, not in all cases, but quite often they just don't have that experience whatsoever of partnership working.
Mm,
As I said before about the music hub people, sometimes because they are just the kind of boots on the ground, they aren't, because they're not management, they're not involved in that kind of level of partnership working. So for the CME, we try and encourage them ideally to make their own partnership and reflect on it. If they can't, there's like a workaround and they can reflect on other partnerships that are kind of similar to their own working context. But
mhm.
ideally we would like them to go off and try and make a little partnership. So if they were going to do that,
Mhm.
what would be your kind of top tips for how to go about making sure that that's successful?
Wow, it's so exciting. And I am a piano player by background, so I'm a bit biased. And already like all your students as a result. I guess one thing I'd say, which I mentioned earlier, is get to know the existing musical culture in the school. So if you're going to go, partner with a school, for example, that's a really good tip. And it's actually something that comes out very strongly in the Listen, Imagine, Compose toolkit that perhaps you can link to, in the notes. That talks about kind of, having questions to ask the schools, maybe even going in and observing a lesson and getting to know the teacher's practice. Just being as supportive as you can as well is really important. If you're really supportive during a partnership, that will reciprocate, and it will just create a culture where you both want to, or all of you want to, depending on the kind of scale of the partnership, make it work. But yeah, I think it's definitely, a lot of CME students will be taking part in this because they want to develop that educational eye. So go in with an open mind to schools, and don't be too daunted if, there's kind of lots of jargon that you don't understand. Feel free to ask questions, get to know, what all these different kind of policies and frameworks mean in practice. And I think also, we talked about having clear guidelines. So yeah, if you're employed by an organization, and you are very in your rights to ask for clear guidelines and things like that. But if you're actually initiating the partnership, then it's having those sorts of quite I guess quite open-minded discussions where you can mind map, if you like, some of the different things that you might want to get out of it. Because even if you've already got a very clear end goal, everybody might have different things they want to actually get out of it along the way. So if you're able to have those conversations and identify that and plan for it, then that's makes it even more exciting and a more kind of, dynamic partnership, if you like. And then I think it's also, doing a lot of listening, which I think piano players are pretty good at as well. Like, we're all kind of, quite individual people, like kind of used to being one-to-one, like you said, so you're probably quite good listeners anyway. But it's really like a good way to develop that collaborative mindset is to, don't go in with any assumptions whatsoever about the school you're working in. We know this. Every single school is different. The people needs are different. The music teachers kind of, sort of approach to their curriculums and their schemes of work is vastly different as well. So the listening will really, really help, so you understand what's happening and how you can kind of be the most helpful in that context. And then I think also it's, about kind of finding ways to make the project as bespoke as you can. So it could even be that there are particular resources in the school that can be utilized. So in one project I researched recently, there is the largest carillon in the country, which is this lovely kind of organ like instrument but with bells. And the composer in that school supported the children to create their own pieces for the carillon, which just felt so lovely and rooted in their school, and it was really celebrating their local culture and heritage. So, maybe kind of like try and research a little bit, talk to the school about all those different things. And then I've said this before, but it's about just that regular communication and that reflection and that planning. Think about how you're going to communicate. So it's actually on that kind of nuts and bolts level of like, can you have a WhatsApp group? Are you going to email? How often are you going to do that? How are you going to check in? And then I think finally, it's just like having that time to bond with who you're working with. So, get to know the teachers' musical interests. In one project we worked on, the composer actually did a survey for the children and for the teachers where they talked about, their favourite music, what kind of music gets them on the dance floor, things like that. Do they play any instruments? And kind of non-musical questions too, just so they were kind of building that bond really. They're kind of like on the ground things. As you mentioned that, if it's kind of not management level and some of the students don't have that kind of knowledge, I think the governance of partnerships can be quite confusing. Who's accountable to who is not always easy to to kind of, understand, especially with like those kind of multiple partners and players in one project, where there's lots of different funding criteria. So I think if it's something that's small scale, just I guess just be mindful of like, what where the accountability lies and how you're going to kind of, share the responsibility really. And it's also just being really confident with that. So, knowing the school safeguarding policies even, being sensitive to the context of the school and things like that. So yeah, there's probably a lot in there that was quite a big, long stream of consciousness, I think, for that question, but hopefully that's helpful.
That was really, really helpful, and I really like the idea of like focusing on the communication. If you talk to anybody who tries to work with schools, the first thing they will tell you is you can never get hold of the person you want to get hold of. So
Yeah,
that is definitely, I would definitely agree with you there, and the idea of kind of you can learn from them as well as them learning from you, and also I think you're right that sometimes people who haven't got experience of schools go in and they are overwhelmed by the jargon and all the stuff that they don't know. But certainly in my experience of working in primary schools, if you go into a primary school as a musician, they feel like that about you.
yeah,
All of your jargon and all of your expertise is like, oh my goodness. So you've both got things to bring to the partnership, haven't you? And it's about
yeah.
using each other as a resource and kind of getting the best out of each other, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. I think like just to kind of, plug the toolkit again that Nancy Evans and Martin Fortley have worked on, because I've been supporting that as well in the past year or so. It's about, I think they say get to know each other's jargon, actually, yeah. So it's really like understanding like you've got jargon, they've got jargon, you're in it for the same reasons, but there might be a few kind of cognitive dissonances along the way if you've just never come across that before. I've definitely been in schools before where you halfway through a music workshop and then half of the children get up and leave the room, and I don't know, no one's been briefed on why that's happened, and the lesson kind of carries on, and then it's only maybe halfway through the day that you understand that they went for a school photo or something like that. There's such a busy timetable, isn't there? There's this kind of like churn of like all these different things that have to happen, so it will probably, I suppose, actually, yeah, in a kind of slightly more kind of cautionary tale way, go in with expectations that there probably will be a few disruptions, and that flexibility and adaptability is, something that will really stand you in good stead as well, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really, really wise advice to end on there. Thank you so much, Emma. I know that's going
Thank
to be
you.
really, really useful for our learners. And if you're watching this and thinking, oh, the CME sounds interesting, you can look underneath the video and there's a whole load of information that you can click on and find out more about the qualification. And also, if you're just generally interested in hearing more of these conversations, you can subscribe and then you'll get them sent to you as and when the next one's available. We try and do one a month, and you can look back at the ones that we did in January with Dr. Paul Abbott and in February with Beth Brimicombe as well. So thank you very much for watching, and see you all for next month's episode.